Feast of the Skinwalker. Snowlark's Thanksgiving Curse at Widow's Rest, Idaho Territory, 1883. Snowlark rode into the small settlement of Widow's Rest as the first snowflakes of winter began to fall. The sky was overcast, the mountains in the distance hidden behind a veil of gray, the land, vast and empty, stretched out for miles in every direction, dotted only by a few lonely cabins and homesteads. The cold air bit at her cheeks, and the sound of her horse's hooves echoed in the silence. The wind carried the faint smell of pine and the faint trace of something more unsettling. But Snowlark shrugged it off as she had so many other feelings in the past. She was used to traveling alone, especially since the loss of her family many years ago. She had been invited by the widow who ran the small homestead at Widow's Rest. Snowlark had never met the woman, but the invitation had come at the right time. Thanksgiving was fast approaching, and she had nowhere else to go. The widow had been kind enough to send a letter, asking Snowlark to join her for the feast. Despite the odd name of the settlement, Snowlark thought it would be nice to share the holiday with others, even if she didn't know them well. When she arrived at the homestead, the widow was waiting on the porch. The woman was tall and thin, her gray hair tied back in a loose braid that fell over her shoulder. Her face was lined with age, but there was a kindness in her eyes. She smiled warmly when she saw Snowlark, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "You must be Snowlark. I'm Martha, but you can call me Widow if you prefer," the woman said, her voice soft but strong. Snowlark nodded, dismounting from her horse. "Thank you for inviting me, Widow. I appreciate it." The widow led Snowlark inside, where a fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room. The house was small but cozy, with wooden floors and rough-hewn furniture. There was a simple table set for dinner, the smell of roasting meat filling the air. "I hope you're hungry," Widow Martha said, motioning for Snowlark to sit at the table. "We're making a Thanksgiving feast tonight. Nothing fancy, but it'll be warm." Snowlark smiled, grateful for the woman's kindness. As she sat down, she noticed that there were a few other people in the room, settlers from the surrounding area, all gathered for the holiday meal. There was a man with a thick beard who nodded at Snowlark as she entered, a younger woman with bright eyes, and an older couple who sat quietly, their hands folded in their laps. The group seemed uneasy, as though they weren't used to strangers joining their gatherings. As the night went on, Snowlark felt the weight of their stares. They were polite enough, but there was something about the way they looked at her that made her feel like an outsider. Perhaps it was because of her heritage. Snowlark was Native American, and while many had grown used to her people in some parts of the country, there were still those who viewed them with suspicion. She could sense the quiet tension in the room, though no one said anything directly. Instead, the conversations were awkward, stilted. The laughter, when it came, seemed forced. Widow Martha, however, was different. She talked easily with Snowlark, her voice full of warmth as she explained the history of the land around them. The widow had lived at Widow's Rest for many years, ever since her husband had passed away, leaving her alone on the homestead. There were no other families nearby, just a few scattered settlers who had come to try their luck at farming and ranching. The land, however, was not kind to them. The harsh winters, the barren soil, and the isolation made it difficult to make a living. Still, Widow Martha had stayed, determined to carry on in her husband's memory. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned to the history of Widow's Rest itself. Snowlark listened carefully, though a part of her began to feel uneasy. The widow's voice dropped to a low whisper as she spoke of the land's past, of the strange happenings that had occurred in the area over the years. "It was a place," Widow Martha said, "where old spirits lingered, where the earth held secrets that no one could fully understand. People come and go from here, but few stay long enough to tell the stories," Widow Martha said, her eyes darkening as she spoke. "I've seen things, Snowlark." "Strange things." Snowlark was intrigued, but also unsettled. The widow's voice held a sense of caution that she couldn't ignore. As the evening drew to a close, the wind outside howled, sending a chill through the walls. Snowlark couldn't shake the feeling that the land itself was alive, watching them, waiting. She shook the thought from her mind and tried to focus on the warmth of the fire and the meal before her. Later, as Snowlark prepared to retire for the night, Widow Martha showed her to a small room in the back of the house. It was simple but comfortable, with a soft bed and a small window that looked out into the darkened woods. The storm outside had worsened, the wind rattling the window panes, and the snow continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes. The darkness felt deep and oppressive, as if the land itself was closing in. Snowlark undressed slowly, preparing for bed, but something kept her from sleep. It was a strange feeling, like the air was thick with something unseen. She lay on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to shake the sensation of being watched. The whispers from outside, carried on the wind, seemed to grow louder, but she couldn't make out the words. It was then that she heard it, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in the distance, but growing clearer as the minutes passed, a voice, faint and distant, calling her name. Snowlark. Her heart skipped a beat. She sat up, straining her ears to hear. The voice was gone, but the sensation remained, like a shadow lingering just outside the door. Snowlark hesitated, then slowly rose from the bed, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. She crossed the room and opened the door, peering out into the dark hallway. Nothing. Widow's Rest had been quiet when she first arrived, but now it felt different. The air was thick with something unnatural, and Snowlark wasn't sure she wanted to know what it was. She closed the door and returned to her bed, but sleep eluded her. The night stretched on endlessly, each passing moment filled with unease. Snowlark tried to ignore the whispers, tried to pretend they were just the wind, but deep down, she knew they weren't. She wasn't alone in Widow's Rest, and whatever else lingered here, it wasn't friendly. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived with a pale, soft light filtering through the windows. Snowlark woke up early, feeling a strange mixture of anticipation and unease. The whispers from the night before still echoed in her mind, but she tried to shake them off as she stretched her limbs and began to prepare for the day. She could hear the widow moving about downstairs, the sounds of pots and pans clinking as the meal preparations began in earnest. When Snowlark made her way to the kitchen, she was greeted by the warmth of the fire and the smell of roasting turkey, vegetables, and spices. Widow Martha was already busy at work, her hands moving skillfully as she prepared the final touches for the meal. "Good morning, Snowlark," the widow said with a smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I hope you slept well." Snowlark nodded, but didn't say much. She could still feel the strange heaviness in the air, but she tried to focus on the task ahead. Thanksgiving was a time for gathering and giving thanks, and she wasn't going to let the unease spoil it. She took a deep breath and helped Martha set the table, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. As they finished setting the table, the other settlers began to arrive. Snowlark noticed that they were a bit more relaxed today, as if the idea of a shared meal had put them at ease. The man with the thick beard, whose name she learned was Jacob, greeted her with a nod. The younger woman, whose name was Sarah, smiled at her warmly, and the older couple, William and Martha, were quieter but nodded in acknowledgement. Everyone seemed to be in a better mood as the meal was laid out. The table was filled with dishes. Steamed vegetables, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and of course the perfectly golden turkey. Widow Martha had also made a rich bread stuffing that filled the room with its mouth-watering aroma. It was a simple meal, but it had a homey, comforting quality that made Snowlark feel a little more at ease. They all sat down at the table, and Widow Martha raised her glass of water in a quiet toast. "To good health, good company, and a blessed Thanksgiving," she said softly. The group raised their glasses in agreement, and for a moment, Snowlark felt like part of the family. They all began to pass the food around, and the conversation flowed more easily than it had the night before. They spoke about the harvest, the weather, and the little things that made life in Widow's Rest bearable. But as the meal progressed, Snowlark began to notice something strange. The settlers seemed a bit too eager to eat. They devoured their food with a hunger that was more than just physical. Their eyes were wide, almost feverish, and their movements were quick, as if they were afraid that the meal would somehow disappear before they could get their fill. Snowlark watched them closely, feeling the tension in the room grow thicker as they ate in silence, each person lost in their own thoughts. Widow Martha, too, seemed strangely distant, her face pale as she ate, her eyes occasionally flicking to the window as if she were expecting something, or someone, outside. Snowlark felt a cold chill run down her spine. It was as if the very air in the room had changed, thickening with a sense of dread that made it hard to breathe. "Is everything all right, Widow?" Snowlark asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The widow looked at her, her face pale and strained. "It's just the land," she said softly. "It's always been like this. Every Thanksgiving. Something about the earth here, it's not right." Snowlark's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Widow Martha hesitated before answering, her eyes darting nervously to the others at the table. They were all still eating, but their movements had become even more frantic, more animalistic. "This place, it's haunted. Not by ghosts, but by something older, something darker. And every year, on Thanksgiving, the curse comes back." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Snowlark felt her throat tighten, her mouth dry. "A curse?" she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "What kind of curse?" "The Skinwalker. It's what the land calls it." A creature of the night, born of old magic and dark spirits. It comes when the land is ready, and it feeds on us, on our fear, on our lives. Snowlark's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the widow's words. She had heard stories of skinwalkers before, legends told in hushed whispers around campfires, creatures that could take the shape of animals, or even people, to do their bidding. But she never imagined the stories could be true. Just then, the wind outside began to howl, rattling the windows. A thick, cold gust swept through the house, sending a shiver down Snowlark's spine. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, stretching across the walls as the light from the fire flickered and dimmed. The tension in the room grew palpable. The settlers' eyes flicked nervously toward the door, their hands gripping their utensils tightly as if they were ready for something to happen. Snowlark looked from face to face, seeing the fear that was barely masked beneath the surface of their calm exteriors. "What do we do?" Snowlark asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How do we stop it?" "We can't stop it," she said quietly. "We can only survive it." The idea of a creature, something that could take any form, stalking the land around them filled her with dread. But there was something in Widow Martha's voice, something in the way she spoke, that made Snowlark realize that the danger was real. It wasn't just a story or an old legend. The curse of Widow's Rest was alive and breathing. Outside, the wind howled louder, and Snowlark thought she heard a low, guttural growl carried on the breeze. It sent a cold shiver through her body. She glanced at the others at the table. They were still eating, their eyes wide, their faces almost slack with hunger. It was as if they couldn't stop, as if something was driving them. Widow Martha seemed to notice Snowlark's growing unease. "Don't worry, Snowlark," she said softly, her voice trembling. "It will be over soon. The Skinwalker always comes, but it always leaves too." Snowlark wasn't so sure. The air felt thick with something else, something dark that seemed to be closing in around them. The settlers continued to eat, their movements becoming more frantic, their faces gaunt and desperate. As Snowlark looked around the room, the sense of unease settled deep in her chest. She couldn't ignore the fear in their eyes, nor the way the shadows seemed to stretch across the room like living things. She had no idea what the Skinwalker wanted, or how to fight it, but one thing was certain. She had to survive, for as long as she could. The evening passed in an uneasy silence, the tension in the air thickening with every hour. After the Thanksgiving meal, the settlers moved about restlessly, as if they were waiting for something. Snowlark couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The wind outside howled relentlessly, and the shadows inside the house seemed to grow darker as the night deepened. Snowlark sat near the fire, her eyes flicking nervously to the window. The whispers from the night before still echoed in her mind, and she couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of dread that had taken hold of her. The widow's words about the Skinwalker, the ancient creature that roamed the land every year, kept replaying in her thoughts. It seemed impossible, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the unease she had felt since her arrival was not just in her head. The settlers, too, had become quiet. Jacob, the man with the thick beard, sat by the window, his eyes scanning the darkened landscape. His posture was tense, as if he were waiting for something to appear. Sarah, the young woman, fidgeted nervously with her hands, her face pale under the flickering firelight. The older couple, William and Martha, sat huddled together, whispering softly, their words barely audible. Snowlark could sense that they were all on edge, but none of them spoke openly about the fear that seemed to grip them. Widow Martha, who had been so kind earlier, now seemed distant and withdrawn, her eyes darting around the room as if she were searching for something. She hadn't spoken much since the meal, and Snowlark could see the weight of the curse bearing down on her. As the night grew colder, Snowlark decided to retire to her room. The house felt stifling, and she needed some space to gather her thoughts. The moment she stood, the door slammed shut with a violent gust of wind rattling the entire house. Snowlark froze, her heart racing as she glanced toward the window. The storm outside had intensified, and the snow was falling in thick, heavy sheets. She closed her door behind her and crossed to the window, peering out into the darkness. The wind howled like a living thing, and the trees outside groaned under the weight of the snow. In the distance, she thought she saw something moving, something large and dark, lurking at the edge of the woods. She strained her eyes, but the figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. A cold shiver ran down Snowlark's spine. She couldn't explain it, but the presence outside felt wrong, unnatural, like a shadow stalking the land. She tried to dismiss the thought, telling herself it was just the storm playing tricks on her mind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. As she turned away from the window, the door to her room creaked open. Snowlark spun around, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing in the doorway, was the widow. Martha's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "You felt it too, didn't you?" she whispered. Snowlark nodded, unable to find her voice. There in the room was heavy, thick, with an oppressive force that seemed to weigh on her chest. She could feel the presence now, pressing in from all sides. The wind outside had died down, but the silence was deafening, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "Come," Martha said, her voice low. "We must prepare." "It's coming." Snowlark followed the widow, her feet light on the floor but her heart pounding. They made their way to the main room where the settlers were gathered. The room was eerily still, the only sound the crackling of the fire. No one spoke as they all turned toward Martha, waiting for her to say something, to explain what was happening. Martha took a deep breath and stood tall, her hands trembling. "The Skinwalker is near. It has sensed our fear, and it will not stop until it feeds." She paused, her voice thick with sorrow. "We are all marked." The settlers exchanged nervous glances, but none of them said anything. Snowlark felt the weight of their fear pressing down on her. She had heard stories of skinwalkers, creatures that could shift between human and animal forms, beings driven by an insatiable hunger, but she had never imagined that she would be caught in such a situation. The reality of it, the truth of Martha's words, was too much to bear. "It will take one of us," Martha continued, her voice trembling. "It always does. We have to protect ourselves, or we'll all be lost." Snowlark felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Martha's eyes darkened. "We must stay together. We cannot let it divide us, and we must not show fear." But just as she finished speaking, the house seemed to shift. The wind outside grew louder again, the windows rattling as if something was pressing against them from the outside. Snowlark's pulse quickened, and she could feel the temperature drop suddenly, a chill seeping into the room. Then there was a sound, soft at first, like the scratching of claws against wood. It grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. Snowlark turned toward the door, her breath caught in her throat. The sound was coming from the hallway outside, echoing through the walls like someone was pacing just beyond reach. Jacob was the first to move. He stood abruptly, his hand on the handle of a rifle that was leaning against the wall. His knuckles were white with tension as he stared at the door. The others rose, one by one, gathering near the walls, their eyes darting toward the sound. And then it happened. The door slammed open with such force that it rattled the walls, and a dark figure stood in the doorway. At first, Snowlark couldn't make it out. Its form was blurry, shifting and changing with every passing second. It was tall, far taller than any man, and its shape seemed to ripple like smoke, constantly in motion. It had the outline of a human, but its features were distorted, its face twisted in a grotesque animalistic form. Its eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. A guttural growl reverberated through the room, sending a wave of terror through Snowlark's body. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The creature, whatever it was, stepped forward, its presence overwhelming, suffocating the very air in the room. The settlers froze, paralyzed by fear. Jacob lifted his rifle, but the creature's gaze locked with his, and it seemed to mock him. The rifle trembled in Jacob's hands, as if the very sight of the creature was enough to drain all the strength from him. The creature's growl became louder, more distinct, and Snowlark felt her heart race in her chest. It wasn't just a creature. It was a force, a presence that could twist reality itself, and it was here for them. Widow Martha stepped forward, her voice shaking as she spoke the words that Snowlark couldn't understand, words that seemed to come from somewhere ancient, something older than the land itself. But it didn't matter. The creature stepped into the room, its form shifting, its hunger palpable. Snowlark knew in that moment that the fight for their lives had begun. The room fell into a heavy silence as the creature stepped into the house. Its presence was overwhelming, like a dark cloud blocking out the light, its form shifting and changing in the dim firelight. Snowlark stood frozen in place, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing to make sense of what was happening. The settlers were paralyzed, their faces pale with terror. The creature seemed to feed on their fear, growing stronger with every passing second. Snowlark's thoughts scrambled. The stories she had heard about skinwalkers, about creatures that could shapeshift and transform, had always seemed like distant legends, tales passed down by elders, told around campfires to warn the young. But now, standing in the presence of this thing, she understood the truth. The Skinwalker was real. It wasn't just a myth. It was a force of nature, a thing born from darkness and magic, an ancient curse that had haunted Widow's Rest for years. Widow Martha was the first to move. Her face, usually calm and composed, was now twisted with fear. She stepped toward the creature, her eyes filled with something else, something determined. Snowlark could see it in her expression, a sense of knowing, of having lived through this before. "We need to stop it," the widow muttered, her voice trembling, but her step sure. "We can't let it feed." "Not again." Snowlark's mind raced. The creature moved closer, its eyes glowing an unnatural red. It had no real form, its shape always shifting, but Snowlark could see the outline of a man, then the twisting image of an animal, then back to something human again. Its eyes locked onto her, and for a moment it felt like it was staring straight into her soul. "How do we stop it?" Snowlark asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Her legs were shaky, her fear making it hard to think, but she had to know. She had to do something. Widow Martha's voice dropped to a quiet murmur as she turned to face Snowlark. "The Skinwalker feeds on fear," she said. "It was a man, once. A man who turned to dark magic, who betrayed his people, and the land cursed him for it. It's not just the body it takes the very spirit. It destroys everything it touches." Snowlark's eyes widened. "But why does it come here, every year?" Martha nodded slowly, her expression grave. "It's tied to the land. This land, Widow's Rest, was cursed long ago. The Skinwalker comes back every Thanksgiving to remind us of that curse. It feasts on the fear of those who live here, and it won't stop until it has taken what it wants." As Snowlark processed the widow's words, she realized the true horror of what they were dealing with. It wasn't just a creature. This thing was a manifestation of the land's curse. It was a reminder of the darkness that had settled over Widow's Rest. And as much as she wanted to run, to escape, she knew that there was no way out. Not unless they stopped it. The creature, sensing the rising tension, growled low, the sound vibrating through the walls. Snowlark felt her skin prickle with dread as it began to move again, its form shifting faster now, more erratic. It was as if the creature could sense their fear, and it was growing more powerful by the second. "We need to fight it," Snowlark said, her voice trembling but determined. "There must be something we can do." Martha's gaze softened, as if she had been expecting this question. She nodded. "There is a way. But it's dangerous. It requires ancient knowledge, rituals passed down through my family and through yours. You, Snowlark, are the key." "Me? But I don't know any rituals. I don't know what to do." Martha's eyes narrowed as she studied Snowlark carefully. "You are the descendant of the people who once protected this land. Your ancestors knew the magic of the earth, the balance between nature and spirit. You carry that power even if you don't know it. You must use it now. The only way to stop the Skinwalker is to confront it at its source, on the land itself. We must perform a ritual to banish it, to sever its connection to Widow's Rest." Snowlark swallowed hard. The thought of confronting the creature in the very place it had haunted for so long terrified her, but she knew Martha was right. There was no other way. The creature was too strong. Too much had been lost to fear already. "We must face it together," Martha continued, "but you must be the one to lead the ritual. Only someone with your bloodline can perform it. You must bind the land's curse, or it will never stop." Snowlark felt a strange calmness wash over her, the same calm she had felt when she had first arrived at Widow's Rest, when she had felt the land speaking to her. She had sensed something ancient in this place, something alive and powerful. Now, it was time to listen to it, to understand it. She turned to face the others. Jacob, Sarah, and the older couple were still standing frozen in place, their eyes wide with fear. Snowlark knew they were waiting for her to lead them. They were all depending on her now. "Gather around," Snowlark said, her voice steadier now. "We need to act quickly." The widow led them outside, and the air grew colder with each step. The storm had died down, leaving behind an unnatural stillness in the night. The trees around Widow's Rest stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind, but no birds or animals stirred in the darkness. It felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. At the edge of the woods, the creature stood waiting, its glowing eyes locked onto Snowlark. It snarled, its body shifting again, and Snowlark could feel the darkness pressing in on her. But she didn't flinch. She had come this far, and now there was no turning back. Martha stepped beside her, her voice low but firm. "Focus, Snowlark. Use your connection to the earth. Let the land guide you." Snowlark closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The earth beneath her feet seemed to hum with energy. She could feel the weight of the land, the history of the curse, the power that had been buried here for so long. She reached out with her mind, allowing herself to connect with the earth's ancient rhythms, to feel the pulse of the land. When she opened her eyes again, everything had changed. The creature was no longer just a terrifying shadow. It was a part of the land itself, a manifestation of the curse that had taken root here long ago. And Snowlark could see it now in its true form, not just a beast, but a tortured soul, lost and twisted by the dark magic it had once sought to control. With Martha's guidance, Snowlark began the ritual. She spoke the ancient words, words passed down from her ancestors, words that called on the earth's power to heal and to bind. She felt the earth respond, its power surging through her, and for the first time she felt connected to something greater than herself. The creature roared as the energy built, its form flickering as the land rejected it, trying to expel the darkness. With a final desperate cry, the Skinwalker shrieked and disappeared into the night, its form unraveling as the earth claimed it once again. The storm that had been brewing in the air slowly faded, leaving the land still and silent once more. Snowlark collapsed to her knees, the exhaustion overwhelming her. But as she looked around, she saw the others standing there, alive, breathing, free. The curse had been lifted. Widow's Rest was safe, for now. Snowlark's heart was pounding in her chest as she knelt on the cold ground, her body trembling with exhaustion. The air was still, a heavy silence settling over Widow's Rest. She could feel the weight of everything that had happened. The terror, the fear, the curse, all of it. And now, it was finally over. The Skinwalker, the dark force that had plagued the land for so long, was gone. The earth had rejected it. The curse had been broken. And the land, once filled with darkness, now felt lighter, calmer. But even as the creature had vanished, Snowlark knew that the price for this victory had been high. Her energy was drained, and her body felt as though it had been stretched to its limit. The land had given her strength, but it had also taken much from her in return. She glanced around at the others, Jacob, Sarah, William, and Martha, all of them standing silently, their faces pale but relieved. They had survived, but their eyes reflected the deep toll that the events of the night had taken on them. Widow Martha stepped forward, her hand resting on Snowlark's shoulder, offering comfort without words. "You did it," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet admiration. "You broke the curse. You saved us all." Snowlark nodded, but she could hardly find the strength to speak. Her throat was dry and her body ached with every movement. She looked toward the horizon, where the first light of dawn was beginning to break through the dark clouds, painting the sky in shades of soft pink and gold. It was a new day, a new beginning. But she couldn't shake the lingering feeling of unease, the sensation that something, though defeated, was still watching from the shadows. The others gathered around her, each of them offering a word of thanks, a gesture of relief. But their words seemed distant, as though they were floating far above the earth, disconnected from the reality of what they had just faced. No one could fully understand the weight of what had happened, not unless they had lived through it. Widow's Rest had been cursed for so long, and though the Skinwalker had been banished, the scars on the land would not vanish so easily. "We need to go inside," Jacob said, his voice rough but steady. He had been one of the first to react when the Skinwalker appeared, his hand shaking as he tried to aim his rifle. Now his grip on the weapon was relaxed, but his eyes were distant, his thoughts clearly far from the present moment. Snowlark nodded, barely able to stand on her own. Martha helped her to her feet, supporting her as they made their way back to the homestead. The house, which had once felt so oppressive, now seemed like a sanctuary, a place of safety after the long, terrifying night. The fire inside was still crackling, casting a soft glow across the room. Snowlark sank into one of the chairs, grateful for its warmth. Her body was sore, but the exhaustion was beginning to ease. As the others settled into the room, a strange stillness filled the space. No one spoke at first, each of them lost in their own thoughts, processing what had happened. Snowlark felt the weight of their gazes on her, the unspoken gratitude and awe they held for her. She could hear Sarah's soft breaths and the quiet murmurs of the older couple, William and Martha, who were still shaken but alive. The night had been a nightmare, but now they were free. "I never thought I'd see the day," Jacob said quietly, breaking the silence. "I've heard the stories, but I never believed it. A creature like that, it seemed like something out of a dream, a nightmare. But you stopped it, Snowlark. You saved us all." Snowlark felt her heart swell with a mixture of relief and sorrow. The curse had been broken, but the memories would never fade. Widow's Rest would never be the same, not after everything that had happened. The land had been tainted by the Skinwalker's curse, and though it was gone now, its influence would linger in the minds of those who had lived through it. "I don't feel like I saved anyone," Snowlark said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just did what needed to be done. The land helped me. But I couldn't have done it without all of you." Widow Martha sat down next to her, her weathered hands folding together in her lap. "You did what no one else could do. The curse was always here, buried deep in the land. But you, your bloodline, your strength, was the only thing that could break it. You are a part of this land, Snowlark, and it will always be a part of you." Snowlark looked out the window, her gaze drifting to the dark trees that surrounded the homestead. The storm had passed, but the air still felt charged with an energy she couldn't explain. The land was alive, as it always had been, but now it was peaceful. The darkness had been banished, at least for now. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with curiosity. "Is it really over?" She wanted to believe that it was over, that Widow's Rest was safe, that the curse had truly been lifted. But deep down, she knew that curses like the one that had plagued this land didn't vanish so easily. The Skinwalker had been banished, yes, but there would always be something left behind, a scar on the earth, a memory of the dark magic that had once ruled here. "We go on," Snowlark said after a long pause. "We rebuild. We remember what happened, but we don't let it define us. Widow's Rest is still here." "And we're still here." The others nodded, a sense of agreement settling in the room. They had survived. Together. The horrors of the past couldn't be undone, but they could move forward, united by the shared experience of what they had endured. The fear that had once ruled their lives was gone. Now they had the freedom to live again. As the morning light slowly filled the room, Snowlark felt a sense of peace wash over her. The land was still. The curse had been lifted. And though she knew that the scars of the past would never fully fade, she also knew that she had done something important, something that no one else could have done. She had faced the darkness and conquered it, and in doing so, she had given Widow's Rest a chance at a new beginning. "Thank you," Martha said quietly, her voice full of emotion. "You've given us our lives back, Snowlark. I'll never forget what you've done for us." Snowlark smiled weakly, her body still sore from the battle, but her heart light with the knowledge that the nightmare was over. The Skinwalker was gone. The curse had been broken. And now they were free to start anew. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the warmth of the flames a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was hope. Snowlark closed her eyes, feeling the peace settle in her bones. It was over. They were safe, and for the first time in a long while she felt truly at home.